The first time Xander Carmichael walked into the Crossroads Tavern, Shira Korven was balancing 3 plates of roasted chicken and winter vegetables up her left arm while a fourth steamed in her right hand, and the smell made her stomach clench with a hunger she had learned to ignore during her shifts. She set the plates down at table 7 with practiced efficiency, her green fingers careful not to let a single drop of gravy spill onto the worn wooden surface. The farmers who sat there barely looked at her, already reaching for their forks, and she stepped back before any of them could complain about an orc blocking their light. The tavern was warm with bodies and cooking fires, filled with the low rumble of conversation and the clink of tankards, and Shira moved through it all like a shadow, visible only when someone needed something. The new man had taken the corner table, the one that gave a clear view of both the door and the kitchen entrance. He was tall, perhaps just over 6 feet, with dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime in the past decade. His coat was well made but practical, the kind a man wore when he traveled often and valued durability over fashion. He did not call out for service. He simply sat, his hands folded on the table, and waited. Shira approached with a wooden mug of ale, the house offering for anyone who took a seat. "Welcome to Crossroads," she said, setting the mug down. "The special today is chicken with root vegetables, or there is mutton stew if you prefer something heavier." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were gray, the color of winter clouds. They moved over her face without flinching, taking in the small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, the pointed ears, the green skin that marked her as other in this human settlement. Most patrons did one of 3 things when they first saw her. They looked away quickly, they stared with open hostility, or they treated her like a piece of furniture. This man did none of those things. He simply looked at her the way he might look at anyone else. "The chicken," he said. His voice was low and rough like gravel underfoot. "And water, please." She nodded and turned away, adding his order to the mental list she kept. The kitchen was a controlled chaos of heat and motion, where Petra the cook ruled with an iron ladle, and her 2 daughters chopped and stirred and basted under her sharp instructions. Shira called out the order, and Petra grunted acknowledgement, already turning to pull a plate from the warming shelf. "New fellow at table 12, Petra said, jerking her chin toward the dining room. "Looks like quality. Make sure his plate is full." Shira took the prepared dish, piled high with golden roasted chicken and vegetables glazed with butter and herbs, and carried it back out. The smell was overwhelming this close, rich and savory, and her mouth watered despite herself. She had not eaten since before dawn, a quick bowl of grain porridge in the room she rented above the stable. She would not eat again until her shift ended at sundown, and even then it would be something simple and cheap, eaten alone. The law was clear, posted on a wooden board near the tavern entrance where everyone could see it. No orc, half-orc, or goblinkin may consume food or drink upon the premises of any establishment licensed for human patronage. Violators subject to fine and imprisonment. The bylaw was old, dating back to the wars 20 years past, when orc raiders had swept down from the northern mountains and burned half the frontier settlements to ash. The wars had ended with treaties and truces, and orcs like Shira had been born after the last battle, but the fear remained, crystallized into laws that made sure everyone remembered which race had lost. She could serve the food. She could cook it, carry it, clean the plates after. She just could not eat it, not here, not in the place where she spent 10 hours a day surrounded by it. Xander Carmichael accepted his plate with a nod of thanks, and Shira watched from the corner of her eye as he ate, methodical and slow, his attention seemingly on his meal but his gaze occasionally drifting to the room around him. He did not drink the ale, she noticed. The mug sat untouched while he finished his water and waited, patient, until she could bring him a second helping. The afternoon crowd thinned as the sun moved lower in the sky, farmers and travelers finishing their meals and heading back to their work or their rooms. Shira cleared tables and wiped them down, her movements efficient from years of practice. She was fast, quiet, and never gave anyone cause to complain. The tavern owner, Gareth Moss, liked her because she worked harder than his human servers and he could pay her less. It was a good position, as far as orc employment went in a human town. The alternative was field work or the slaughterhouses on the edge of town, and Shira preferred the tavern, even with its smells and its constant reminder of what she could not have. Xander Carmichael left 3 copper coins on the table when he finally stood, more than the meal cost, and walked out without a word. Shira pocketed the coins and cleared his place, noting that he had eaten every bite, even scraping the plate clean of gravy. He came back the next day at the same time, taking the same corner table, and the day after that, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, Shira knew his pattern. He arrived in the mid-afternoon, between the lunch rush and the evening crowd when the tavern was at its quietest. He ordered the daily special, whatever it was, and a glass of water. He ate slowly, watching the room with that same steady, evaluating gaze. He never complained, never sent anything back, never caused trouble. He always left exact change plus a small tip, and he never tried to make conversation beyond the bare minimum of placing his order. Gareth noticed him, of course. The tavern owner noticed everyone who spent money in his establishment. "That is the new magistrate," he told Shira one afternoon, leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms folded. "Xander Carmichael, circuit judge appointed by the territorial governor. He will be hearing cases here through the winter, settling disputes and such. Mind you give him good service. A man like that could cause trouble if he is not treated proper." Shira nodded, not trusting herself to speak. A magistrate, an officer of the law, the kind of man who enforced the bylaws that governed her life. She felt a small, bitter twist in her chest, though she could not have said why. It was not as though she had expected anything else. But Xander Carmichael continued to come, day after day, and he continued to watch her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. The first snow came early that year, dusting the frontier town of Crossroads with white and sending everyone indoors to huddle near fires and hot meals. The tavern grew busier as the weather turned, packed with people who wanted warmth and company, and Shira worked longer hours to keep up with the demand. Her feet ached by the end of each shift, and her arms were sore from carrying heavy trays, but she never let it show. Complaints were a luxury she could not afford. Xander came in one afternoon when the snow was falling thick outside, shaking the flakes from his coat before taking his usual seat. Shira brought him the special, a thick beef stew with bread, and set it down carefully. As she turned to leave, he spoke. "You work here every day." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes, sir. 6 days a week, long hours." "Yes, sir." He picked up his spoon, studying the stew as though it held some secret. "You are a good server, efficient." Shira did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and retreated to the kitchen. Praise from customers was rare, and from a magistrate it felt almost dangerous, like a trap she could not see. She tried not to think about it, focusing instead on the next order, the next table, the next task. But she found herself watching him too, in the stolen moments between tasks. He ate alone always, and no one approached his table. The other patrons seemed to sense something about him, some quality that made them keep their distance. He was not unfriendly exactly, but there was a hardness to him, a shell that warned people not to pry. Shira recognized it because she had built a similar shell around herself. The armor of someone who had learned that softness was a weakness the world would exploit. One evening, as the tavern was emptying out and Shira was wiping down tables, she found a plate left at the corner table. Xander had gone, but his meal sat there, barely touched, the stew still steaming slightly. It was not like him to leave food behind. She stood there for a moment, confused, before she realized what he had done. He had left it for her. She looked around quickly, but no one was watching. Gareth was in the back room, counting the day's receipts. Petra had gone home. The few remaining customers were focused on their own meals and conversations. Shira stood frozen, staring at the plate, her heart pounding. It was a gift, clearly, but also a test. If anyone saw her eat it, they could report her. The fine for violating the bylaw was steep, more than a month's wages, and the imprisonment could last weeks. But she was hungry, so hungry, and the stew smelled like heaven. She made her decision in an instant, picking up the plate and carrying it swiftly into the kitchen. She ate standing up, spooning the stew into her mouth as fast as she could, barely tasting it in her haste. It was good, rich and hearty, and she felt warmth spread through her chest as she swallowed. She finished it in minutes, washed the plate quickly, and returned to her work as though nothing had happened. That night, lying in her narrow bed above the stable, she thought about what he had done. It was a small thing, leaving food behind, but it was also illegal. If he were caught deliberately circumventing the bylaw, even a magistrate could face consequences. Why would he take that risk? For her, an orc girl he barely knew. She did not have an answer, but she found herself thinking about his gray eyes, the way they looked at her without flinching, and the quiet in his manner that felt less like coldness and more like careful control. Winter settled in hard, and the tavern became a refuge from the bitter winds that howled through crossroads. Xander continued his routine, coming every afternoon, eating his meal with slow precision, and occasionally leaving a portion behind. Shira never acknowledged it directly, but she made sure to clear his table herself always, and she began to time her breaks so that she could slip into the kitchen and eat whatever he left before anyone else noticed. It became a strange, silent ritual between them. He never said anything about it, and neither did she, but the understanding grew, fragile and unspoken. She began to notice other things about him too. The way he listened when people spoke, really listened, his attention focused entirely on the speaker. The way he treated everyone with the same measured courtesy, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest laborer. The way he seemed tired, sometimes, as though he carried a weight no one else could see. He held court in the town hall 3 days a week, hearing cases and issuing judgments. Shira heard about it from the tavern gossip, the endless stream of talk that flowed through the dining room like water. Xander Carmichael was fair but strict, they said. He did not bend the law, but he did not twist it to favor the powerful either. He listened to both sides, asked questions in that rough, quiet voice, and then made his ruling. Some people left his court satisfied, others angry, but no one could claim he was corrupt or careless. One afternoon in late autumn, a man named Heller came into the tavern, red-faced and loud, complaining about the new magistrate to anyone who would listen. "He ruled against me," Heller announced, slamming his fist on a table. "Said I owed Brennan for that fence repair, even though the work was shoddy. That judge does not understand how things work around here." Gareth, polishing glasses behind the bar, shook his head. "Carmichael follows the law. If he ruled against you, it is because the law was not on your side." "The law," Heller spat. "Easy for you to say. You are not the one losing coin. Shira, passing by with a tray of empty mugs, said nothing, but she felt a small flicker of satisfaction. She did not know the details of Heller's case, but she knew Heller, and she knew he was the kind of man who cheated whenever he thought he could get away with it. If Xander had ruled against him, it was probably because Heller deserved it. That afternoon, when Xander came in and took his usual seat, she brought him his meal and allowed herself a brief smile. He glanced up, surprised, and for a moment something almost like warmth flickered in his gray eyes. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she replied, and meant it. The days grew shorter and colder, and the work at the tavern intensified. The harvest season brought travelers through crossroads, traders and merchants and laborers heading south before the roads became impassable. Shira worked from dawn until well after dark, her hands chapped from washing dishes, her back aching from bending over tables. But the tips were better, and she saved every coin, hoarding them in a small pouch under her mattress. She did not know what she was saving for, only that she wanted something more than this someday, if such a thing were possible for someone like her. Xander's presence became a constant in her life, as reliable as the sunrise. She began to look forward to his arrival each day, to the quiet moment when she could set his meal down and exchange a few words. He asked her about the tavern, about the town, about her life in careful, measured questions that never pried too deep. She answered cautiously at first, but gradually she found herself saying more, trusting him in a way she had not trusted anyone in a long time. "How long have you worked here?" he asked one day. "3 years," she said, "since I was old enough to be hired. And before that, I lived in the orc settlement north of town. When I turned 16, I left. There was not enough work there, and I wanted." She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Wanted what?" "More," she said simply. "Something different," he nodded, as though this made perfect sense. "And you found it here." "I found work here," she corrected. "That is not quite the same thing." He studied her for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a softening she had not seen before. "No," he agreed, "it is not." That night, she lay awake thinking about their conversation, about the way he had looked at her, and she felt something stir in her chest, fragile and tentative, like the first green shoot pushing through snow. She did not let herself name it yet. It was too dangerous, too foolish. But it was there, growing quietly, and she could not stop it any more than she could stop the seasons from turning. Winter arrived in full force, and with it came the long, dark nights that made the tavern feel like the only warm place in the world. Shira worked through the cold months, serving meals and clearing tables, and pretending not to notice the way Xander watched her, or the way her heart quickened when he walked through the door. One evening in early December, a group of men from the Tavern Keepers Guild came to visit Gareth, and Shira heard them talking in low voices near the bar. She was not supposed to listen, but she had learned long ago to pay attention when people thought she was not. The guild was concerned, they said, about certain legal challenges being raised. Someone was questioning the bylaws that governed orc employment and patronage, filing petitions, and citing old precedents that might undermine the current restrictions. "It is that new magistrate," one of the men said, his voice bitter. "Carmichael. He has been digging through the territorial codes looking for ways to change things. Says the bylaws are inconsistent with newer treaties." Gareth frowned. Why would he care? "The laws have been in place for 20 years. Who knows?" Another man replied. "But if he keeps pushing, he could cause real problems. The guild is considering a formal complaint to the governor. We cannot have some outsider coming in and disrupting the way things work." Shira's hands trembled as she cleared a nearby table, her mind racing. Xander was trying to change the law. For her, or for orcs in general, and if the guild was planning to fight him, What did that mean for his career, his position? She wanted to ask him, to demand answers, but when he came in the next day, she found herself tongue-tied, unable to form the questions. Instead, she served his meal in silence, and he ate without speaking, the space between them heavy with things unsaid. But after he finished, he did something different. Instead of leaving immediately, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, setting it on the table. "I need signatures," he said quietly, "from people who are willing to testify that the current bylaws cause undue hardship." "It is for a legal petition." Shira stared at the paper, her heart pounding. "Testify in court?" "Not in open court," he said. "Written statements signed and witnessed. It is part of the process for challenging a bylaw. I need to demonstrate that there is a legitimate grievance." "You are trying to change the law," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the shell he wore, past the careful control, to the man underneath. "Because it is wrong," he said simply. "And because I can." She took the paper with shaking hands, unfolding it to read the words written in his precise, careful script. It was a petition to repeal the bylaw that barred orcs from consuming food and drink in licensed establishments, citing inconsistencies with the Treaty of Northridge and the Territorial Charter of Rights. It was dense legal language, but the meaning was clear. "I will help," she said. "I will gather signatures," he nodded, and something that might have been relief crossed his face. "Thank you." Over the following weeks, Shira carried the petition with her, carefully folded in her apron pocket. She approached other orcs in town, the ones who worked in the fields or the stables or the slaughterhouses, and she explained what Xander was trying to do. Some were skeptical, afraid of retaliation, but others signed eagerly, desperate for any chance at change. She collected names slowly, one by one, and each signature felt like a small act of defiance, a refusal to accept that things had to stay the way they were. It was dangerous work. The guild had eyes everywhere, and if they found out she was gathering support for Xander's petition, they could make trouble for her, maybe even get her fired. But she was careful, approaching people only when she was sure no one was watching, and she kept the paper hidden except when it was needed. Xander continued to come to the tavern every afternoon, and their conversations grew longer, deeper. He told her about his work, the endless depositions and research, the precedents he was digging up from old law books. He had found cases from other territories where similar bylaws had been struck down, and he was building an argument piece by piece, brick by brick, constructing a legal framework that might, just might, be strong enough to withstand the guild's opposition. "It will take time," he warned her. "Months, probably. The law does not move quickly." "I know," she said, "but it is more than anyone else has done." He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not quite affection, not yet, but it was close, a warmth that had not been there before. "You are brave," he said. She shook her head. "I am just tired of being hungry." He smiled then, a real smile, small and fleeting but genuine, and Shira felt her heart turn over in her chest. That night she lay in her narrow bed and admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with him. With his quiet determination, his careful integrity, the way he treated her like a person instead of a problem. It was foolish and impossible, a fantasy that could never survive contact with reality, but she could not stop herself. The feeling was there, lodged in her chest like a coal burning slow and steady, and she knew it would only grow stronger. Winter deepened, and the town of Crossroads became a place of snow and ice and bitter cold. The tavern was packed every night, people crowding in for warmth and food, and Shira worked until her body ached and her mind went numb. But every afternoon, Xander came, and for those few minutes the world narrowed to just the two of them, and she felt less alone. The petition grew heavier in her pocket as more names were added. 20 signatures, then 30, then 40. Each one represented a risk, a person who was willing to stand up and say that the law was unjust. Shira felt the weight of their trust, and she guarded the paper like it was made of gold. In January, Xander filed the formal challenge, submitting the petition along with his legal briefs to the territorial governor's office. The guild reacted immediately, filing their own counter-petition and demanding that the challenge be dismissed. They argued that the bylaws were necessary for public safety, that orcs could not be trusted in establishments where humans ate and drank, that allowing integration would lead to violence and chaos. The arguments were ugly, rooted in fear and prejudice, and Shira heard them repeated in the tavern, whispered by patrons who did not know she was listening. It hurt, hearing herself described as a threat, a danger, something to be kept at arm's length. But she kept working, kept serving, kept gathering signatures when she could, because Xander had shown her that there was another way to fight back. One evening in late January, a man named Coulter, who worked for the guild, came into the tavern and made a point of sitting at the corner table, Xander's usual spot. When Shira approached to take his order, he looked up at her with cold eyes. "I hear you have been busy," he said. Collecting names, stirring up trouble. Shira's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I do not know what you mean." "Sure you do," Coulter said, leaning back in his chair. "That magistrate of yours, he has gotten you all riled up, thinking things can change. But let me tell you something, girl. The guild is not going to let some outsider come in and overturn laws that have kept this town safe for 20 years, and anyone who helps him is going to regret it." "Is that a threat?" Shira asked, her hands clenched into fists. Coulter shrugged. "Just friendly advice. Now, are you going to take my order, or do I need to complain to the owner?" She took his order, her mind racing, and hurried back to the kitchen. Gareth was there, arms folded, and he looked at her with a mix of concern and frustration. "I heard what he said," Gareth told her, "and I want you to know I do not care about your petition or what Carmichael is doing. But if the guild starts making trouble, I cannot protect you. You understand?" Shira nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. Good, now get back to work." That night, she told Xander about the encounter, and his expression darkened. "They are trying to intimidate you," he said. "It is a common tactic when they cannot win on the merits." "What if they succeed?" Shira asked. "What if they get you removed or me fired?" "Then we keep fighting," Xander said, his voice hard. "I did not start this to give up halfway." She believed him, but she also saw the toll the fight was taking. He looked tired, older, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a month ago. He was pushing himself hard, working late into the night on legal briefs, and she worried about him, about what this was costing him personally. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one afternoon, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "Really? You could just enforce the law as it is. No one would blame you." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I was a soldier," he said finally. "Before I became a magistrate, I fought in the border wars, saw things I wish I could forget, and when the wars ended, I thought the killing was over. But then I saw the way the treaties were enforced, the way the laws were written to punish the losing side forever, and I realized the war never really ended. It just changed form." He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a pain she had never seen before. "I cannot undo what happened in the war, but I can try to make sure the peace is real, not just another kind of violence. That is why I do this." Shira felt tears sting her eyes, and she reached out without thinking, her green fingers brushing against his hand. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over and held hers, his grip warm and solid, and they sat like that for a long moment, connected across the space that separated their worlds. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not have to thank me," he said. "This is just what should be done." But she thanked him anyway, because she needed him to know that it mattered, that he mattered, and that whatever happened, she would not forget what he was trying to do. February came, and with it a thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads a muddy mess. The governor's office sent word that the petition would be reviewed, but there was no timeline, no promise of a quick resolution. The guild continued to lobby against the challenge, and the tension in Crossroads grew thick enough to cut. Xander kept coming to the tavern, and their ritual continued. He ate his meals slowly, leaving portions behind, and Shira cleared his table and spirited the food into the kitchen where she could eat it in secret. It was a small act of rebellion, repeated day after day, and it sustained her in more ways than one. But she also began to notice the way people looked at him, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The guild's campaign was working, turning public opinion against him, painting him as a troublemaker who was disrupting the natural order. Some people still respected him, still brought their cases to his court, but others avoided him, and Shira could see the isolation weighing on him. One afternoon in March, he came in looking particularly worn, and when she set his meal down, he barely acknowledged it. She lingered, concerned, and finally worked up the courage to ask, "Are you all right?" He looked up, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his face. "The guild filed a complaint with the governor," he said quietly. "They are asking for me to be removed from my post, claiming I am biased and unfit to serve." Shira felt her blood run cold. "Can they do that?" "They can try," he said. "The governor will review the complaint, and if he decides there is merit, I could be dismissed." "But you have not done anything wrong," Shira protested. "You are just following the law, challenging a bylaw through the proper channels." "The law is not always about right and wrong," Xander said, his voice bitter. "Sometimes it is about power and who has it." Shira sat down across from him, forgetting for a moment that she was not supposed to sit with customers, that she was just a server and he was a magistrate. "What will you do? Keep fighting," he said simply. "What else can I do?" She reached across the table and took his hand, and this time he held on tight, as though she were the only solid thing in a world that was shifting under his feet. "I am with you," she said. "Whatever happens." He looked at her, and the hardness in his expression cracked just a little, revealing the vulnerability underneath. "I know," he said. "That is the only thing keeping me going." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, and Shira felt the weight of the world pressing down on them, but also the strength of the connection between them, fragile but real. Gareth cleared his throat from across the room, and Shira jumped, pulling her hand back and standing quickly. Xander let her go without protest, but his eyes followed her as she retreated to the kitchen, and she felt the warmth of his gaze long after she was out of sight. The governor's review took weeks, and during that time, the tension in Crossroads reached a breaking point. The guild organized meetings, rallying support against Xander's petition, and there were rumors of violence, of threats against anyone who had signed the document. Shira kept the petition hidden, but she also kept gathering names, refusing to be intimidated. In early April, word came down that the governor had dismissed the guild's complaint, finding no evidence of bias or misconduct. Xander's position was secure, and the review of the bylaw would continue. It was a victory, small but significant, and Shira felt a surge of hope for the first time in months. But the guild was not finished. They began a new campaign, this time targeting the businesses that employed orcs, pressuring owners to fire their orc workers or face consequences. Gareth called Shira into his office one afternoon and told her, apologetically, that he was getting pressure to let her go. "I do not want to," he said, wringing his hands. "You are a good worker, maybe the best I have, but the guild is threatening to revoke my license if I do not comply." Shira felt the floor drop out from under her. "When?" "End of the month," Gareth said. "I am sorry, Shira, truly." She nodded numbly and walked out, her mind reeling. Without the job, she had no income, no way to pay rent, no way to survive. She would have to leave Crossroads, go back to the orc settlement or find work somewhere else, and the thought of leaving, of losing the life she had built here, was almost unbearable. That afternoon, when Xander came in, she told him what had happened. His face went pale and then dark with anger. "They are retaliating," he said, "using you to get to me." "It does not matter why," Shira said, her voice shaking. "The result is the same. I am losing everything." Xander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "No," he said, "this ends now. What are you going to do?" "What I should have done from the start," he said. "I am going to force the issue." He left without eating, and Shira watched him go, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Over the next 2 weeks, Xander worked like a man possessed. He filed motions, issued subpoenas, called witnesses, and built a case that was ironclad and irrefutable. He argued that the bylaw was not only unjust, but also illegal under the territorial charter, and he demanded an immediate ruling from the governor's office. The guild fought back hard, but Xander had something they did not: the weight of the law on his side. He had done his research, found his precedents, and constructed an argument that could not be dismissed or ignored. And he had the signatures, 47 names of orcs who were willing to testify that the bylaw caused them harm. In late April, the governor issued his ruling. The bylaw was struck down, effective immediately. All establishments licensed for human patronage were now required to serve patrons without regard to race, and any business that refused could lose its license. The news spread through Crossroads like wildfire, and the reactions were mixed. Some people cheered, seeing it as a step toward justice. Others were furious, claiming the governor had overstepped and that the town was now in danger. The guild vowed to appeal, but for now the law was clear. Shira heard the news from Gareth, who looked stunned as he told her. "You can stay," he said. "I do not have a choice anymore. The law says I have to treat you the same as anyone else." She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and went back to work in a daze. That evening, as the tavern filled with the usual crowd, Xander came in and took his corner table. But this time, when Shira brought him his meal, he did not eat right away. Instead, he stood and pulled out the chair across from him, gesturing for her to sit. Shira froze, her heart racing. People were watching. She could feel their eyes on her, and the weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. "Sit," Xander said quietly. "The law says you can." She sat, her legs trembling, and Xander sat down across from her. He reached across the table and took her hand, and this time he did not let go. "I rewrote the law," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Now you can eat here in the place you have served for 3 years. You can sit at this table and no one can tell you otherwise." Shira felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "You risked everything for this." "I risked everything for you," he corrected. "Because you matter. Because you deserve to be treated like a person, not a problem." He pushed the plate toward her, and she looked down at the roasted chicken and vegetables, the food she had served 1,000 times but never tasted in this place. She picked up the fork with shaking hands and took a bite, and the flavor exploded on her tongue, rich and savory and perfect. It was the best meal she had ever eaten, not because of the food itself, but because of what it represented. Freedom, dignity, the right to exist in a space that had always excluded her. Xander watched her eat, and when she finally set the fork down, he spoke again. "I have one more question to ask you," he said, and his voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "And you can say no if you want. I will understand." Shira looked at him, her heart pounding, and she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection, and she realized that he was as terrified as she was. "Ask," she whispered. He took a deep breath, and then he said, "Shira Korven, will you marry me?" The tavern went silent, every conversation stopping, every eye turning to their table. Shira felt the weight of their stares, but she did not care. All that mattered was the man in front of her, the man who had risked his career and his reputation to give her a seat at the table. "Yes," she said, and her voice rang out clear and strong. "Yes, I will marry you." Xander smiled, a real smile, wide and genuine, and he stood and pulled her into his arms. She held on tight, burying her face in his shoulder, and for the first time in her life she felt truly, completely safe. The tavern erupted in noise, some people cheering, others grumbling, but Shira did not pay attention to any of it. She was too busy holding the man she loved, the man who had changed the world for her, one law at a time. They were married in May, on a warm spring day when the flowers were blooming and the air was sweet with the scent of new growth. The ceremony was small, held in the town square with a handful of friends and witnesses, and Shira wore a simple dress that she had sewn herself. Xander wore his best coat, and when he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to stand by you," he said, "to fight for you, to protect you, and to love you for as long as I live." Shira said her vows through tears, her voice shaking but sincere. "I promise to stand by you," she echoed, "to support you, to trust you, and to love you no matter what comes." They exchanged rings, simple bands of silver, and when the officiant pronounced them married, Xander kissed her, and the world seemed to shift on its axis, realigning itself around this new reality. After the ceremony, they went back to the Crossroads Tavern, and Gareth had prepared a feast in their honor. The tables were laden with food, and for the first time, Shira sat down as a guest, not a server. Xander sat beside her, his hand clasped in hers, and they ate together, laughing and talking with the people who had come to celebrate. It was not a perfect moment. There were still people in town who disapproved, who thought the marriage was wrong, who muttered about race mixing and the breakdown of tradition. But Shira did not care. She had spent her whole life worrying about what other people thought, and she was done with that. She had found someone who loved her, who saw her as she truly was, and that was enough. As the evening wore on, Xander leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Are you happy?" Shira turned to him, and she saw the worry in his eyes, the fear that he had not done enough, that she was settling for less than she deserved. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her green fingers gentle against his skin. "I am happy," she said, "more than I ever thought possible." He relaxed then, the tension draining from his shoulders, and he kissed her again, slow and sweet, and Shira felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. They left the tavern as the sun was setting, walking hand in hand through the streets of Crossroads. Xander had rented a small house on the edge of town, a place where they could start their life together. And as they walked through the door, Shira felt a sense of peace settle over her. "Home," she said softly, and Xander smiled. "Home," he agreed. That night, they lay in bed together, wrapped in each other's arms, and Shira listened to the steady beat of his heart. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, the long months of struggle and fear, the risks they had both taken, and she felt a deep sense of awe at what they had accomplished. "You ever wonder if it was worth it?" she asked quietly. "All the fighting, the danger, the threats." Xander was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Every single day, and every single day I come to the same conclusion. Which is, that you are worth it," he said simply. "That this right here is worth everything." Shira closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, and she held him tighter, trying to memorize the feel of him, the warmth of his body, the safety of his embrace. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "More than I can say." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and Shira dreamed of a future where they could live without fear, where their love was not a scandal but a celebration, where their children, if they had them, would grow up in a world that was kinder and more just than the one they had known. Summer came, and with it a new rhythm to their lives. Shira continued to work at the tavern, but now she also had a home to return to, a husband who waited for her with dinner and conversation and quiet companionship. Xander continued his work as a magistrate, hearing cases and issuing judgments, and his reputation grew. People began to see him not as a troublemaker, but as a reformer, someone who was willing to challenge the status quo when it was unjust. The guild did not give up easily. They filed appeals and motions, trying to overturn the governor's ruling, but Xander fought them at every turn. He had allies now, other lawyers and magistrates who had been inspired by his success, and together they built a coalition that was strong enough to withstand the guild's attacks. In August, the territorial court issued a final ruling, upholding the governor's decision and declaring the old bylaw unconstitutional. It was a sweeping victory, one that set a precedent for other territories to follow, and Shira felt a sense of vindication that was almost overwhelming. "We did it," she said to Xander that night as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars come out. "We actually did it." "You did it," Xander corrected. "You gathered the signatures, you risked your job, you stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent." "I just provided the legal framework." Shira shook her head. "We did it together," she insisted. "Neither of us could have done it alone." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and they sat in comfortable silence, letting the weight of their accomplishment settle over them. As the months passed, their life together grew richer and deeper. They learned each other's habits and quirks, the small things that made up a shared life. Xander liked his coffee strong and his mornings quiet, while Shira was an early riser who preferred to start the day with movement and noise. They compromised, finding a rhythm that worked for both of them, and their home became a place of warmth and laughter. In the autumn, Shira discovered she was pregnant, and the news filled them both with a mix of joy and terror. They had talked about children, but the reality of it was different, more immediate and more daunting. Xander worried about the dangers of childbirth, about whether he would be a good father, about how the world would treat a child who was half orc and half human. Shira worried about the same things, but she also felt a deep sense of rightness, as though this was the next step in a journey they had always been meant to take. The pregnancy was not easy. Shira was sick for the first few months, and there were complications that made Xander hover anxiously, insisting she rest and take care of herself. She chafed at the restrictions, wanting to work and stay active, but she also appreciated his concern, the way he was so clearly terrified of losing her in the spring as the snow melted and the first flowers began to bloom. Shira went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth, and there were moments when Xander thought he might lose her, but she was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined. And when the midwife finally placed the baby in her arms, he felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. The baby was a girl, small and perfect, with green-tinged skin and tiny, barely visible tusks. She had Xander's gray eyes and Shira's pointed ears, and when she opened her mouth to wail, the sound was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever heard. "What should we name her?" Shira asked, exhausted but radiant, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Xander looked down at his daughter, this tiny, miraculous person who was part of him and part of Shira, and he felt his heart overflow with love. "Jenna," he said softly. "Let us call her Jenna." Shira smiled. "Jenna Carmichael," she said, testing the name. "I like it." Jenna grew quickly, a healthy, happy baby who filled their home with noise and chaos and joy. Xander proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor at night when Jenna would not sleep. And Shira watched him with a sense of wonder, amazed at how completely he had embraced this new role. The people of Crossroads had mixed reactions to the baby. Some were kind, bringing gifts and offering congratulations, while others were cold, avoiding the family or making pointed comments about mixed-blood children. But Xander and Shira had learned to ignore the disapproval, focusing instead on building a life that was full of love and purpose. As Jenna grew older, Shira returned to work at the tavern, but now she brought Jenna with her, setting up a small play area in the corner where the baby could nap and play while Shira worked. It was unconventional, but Gareth did not mind, and the regular customers grew fond of the little girl, bringing her treats and toys and making her laugh with silly faces. Xander continued his work as a magistrate, but he also took on new cases, representing orcs and half-orcs who faced discrimination or injustice. He became known as a champion of the underdog, someone who would fight for anyone who had been wronged, regardless of their race or status. His caseload grew, and he was often away from home for days at a time, traveling to other towns and settlements to hear cases. But he always came back to Shira and Jenna, and his homecomings were celebrations, filled with hugs and laughter and stories of his travels. One evening, when Jenna was 2 years old, Shira and Xander sat on their porch, watching their daughter chase fireflies in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was warm and still. "I never thought I would have this," Shira said quietly. "A home, a family, a future. I thought I would spend my whole life serving other people's meals, never having a place of my own." Xander took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. "You deserve all of it," he said, "and more." "We both do," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We fought for it and we earned it." They sat in silence for a while, watching Jenna play, and Shira felt a deep sense of contentment. The world was not perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but she had everything she needed right here. A man who loved her, a daughter who brought her joy, and a future that was open and full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked. Shira smiled. "I am thinking about that first day you walked into the tavern," she said. "I was carrying plates of food I could not eat, and you sat down and watched me with those gray eyes, and I thought you were just another customer. I had no idea you were going to change my life." "I did not know either," Xander admitted. "I just thought you deserved better than what you had. I did not plan to fall in love with you. But you did." "But I did," he agreed, "and I have never looked back." Jenna ran up to them then, her hands cupped around a firefly, her face glowing with excitement. "Look," she said, opening her hands to show them the insect glowing softly in her palms. "I caught one." Shira and Xander leaned in to look, and Jenna opened her hands wide, letting the firefly go. It flew off into the darkening sky, its light blinking on and off, and Jenna laughed and ran after it, chasing the light. "She is going to be like you," Xander said, watching his daughter with a smile. "Strong and brave and unwilling to accept limits." "She is going to be like both of us," Shira corrected. Strong and brave, but also kind and just. She's going to change the world just like we did. Xander pulled Shira close and they sat together, watching their daughter play, and for the first time in a long time, Shira felt truly, completely at peace. The years passed, and their family grew. Jenna was joined by a second daughter, Mara, when she was 3 years old. Mara was quieter than Jenna, more thoughtful, with her father's serious demeanor and her mother's green skin. The two girls were inseparable, playing together and getting into mischief, and Shira and Xander often found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by their clever daughters. Xander's reputation continued to grow, and he was eventually appointed to a higher court, overseeing cases for the entire territory. It was a prestigious position, one that required them to move to a larger town, and though Shira was sad to leave Crossroads, she was also excited for the new opportunities. They bought a house with a big yard, and Shira found work at a new tavern, this one owned by an orc woman who had benefited from the law Xander had changed. The owner, a formidable woman named Kara, treated Shira like an equal, and the two became fast friends, sharing stories and supporting each other through the challenges of running a business and raising families. Jenna and Mara grew up in a world that was slowly changing, where orcs and humans worked side by side, where mixed families were no longer a scandal but a normal part of life. There were still pockets of prejudice, still people who clung to the old ways, but the progress was undeniable, and Shira and Xander felt proud of the part they had played in making it happen. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Shira with a trip back to Crossroads. They left the girls with Kara and traveled to the frontier town where their story had begun. And as they walked through the familiar streets, Shira felt a wave of nostalgia. The Crossroads Tavern was still there, though Gareth had retired and passed the business on to his son. The new owner greeted them warmly, and Xander and Shira sat at the corner table, the one where they had shared so many meals and ordered the daily special. As they ate, Shira looked around the tavern, taking in the changes and the things that had stayed the same. There were orcs working in the kitchen now, she noticed, and a mixed group of humans and orcs sitting together at one of the tables, laughing and talking like old friends. "We did this," she said softly. "We made this possible." "We started it," Xander corrected, "but the people here finished it. They took the law we changed and they made it real, made it part of their lives. That is the true victory." Shira reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat there, holding hands across the scarred wooden surface, just like they had done so many times before. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Xander replied. "Always." They finished their meal and walked out into the spring sunshine hand in hand, and as they made their way back to the inn where they were staying, Shira thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had not been easy, and there had been moments when she had thought they would fail, but they had persevered and they had won. The world was not perfect, but it was better than it had been, and that was enough. That night, as they lay in bed together, Xander pulled Shira close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For being brave enough to let me love you," he said. "For trusting me, for fighting with me, for building this life with me. I could not have done any of it without you." Shira turned to face him, and she saw the depth of emotion in his eyes, the love and gratitude and awe, and she felt her own eyes fill with tears. "You gave me a seat at the table," she said. "You gave me a place in the world. I will never forget that." "You always had a place," Xander said. "I just made sure everyone else recognized it." They held each other in the darkness, and Shira felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the warmth of his body against hers, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. The next morning they returned home to their daughters, and life went on. Jenna started school, where she excelled in her studies and made friends easily, her mixed heritage no longer a barrier but simply a fact of who she was. Mara followed in her sister's footsteps, quieter but no less determined, and both girls grew up knowing that they were loved and valued, that they had a place in the world because their parents had fought to make it so. Years passed, and Xander and Shira grew older, their hair going gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never dimmed. They watched their daughters grow into strong, capable women, and when Jenna announced that she wanted to study law, following in her father's footsteps, Xander cried tears of joy. Mara chose a different path, opening a bakery where she served humans and orcs alike, and her pastries became famous throughout the territory. Both daughters made their parents proud, and Shira and Xander often sat together in the evenings, marveling at what they had built, not just for themselves but for the generations that would come after. On a warm spring day, 20 years after Xander had first walked into the Crossroads Tavern, he and Shira returned to that same corner table one more time. They were older now, their movements slower, but the love between them was as strong as ever. Shira ordered the special, and when it arrived she took a bite and smiled. "Still good," she said. Xander laughed. "Some things never change." "And some things do," Shira said, looking around the tavern, which was now fully integrated, with orcs and humans working and eating side by side. "We changed the world, Xander, you and me." "We changed our corner of it," Xander said modestly. "That is all anyone can do." Shira reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat there, holding hands just like they had done so many times before, and she felt a sense of completion, of a story that had reached its natural end. "I would do it all again," she said softly. "Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of fear, I would do it all again just to end up here with you." Xander squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "So would I," he said. "So would I." They finished their meal and walked out into the spring sunshine, and as they made their way home, Shira thought about the girl she had been, the one who had waited tables in a place where she could not legally eat, and the woman she had become, the one who had a home, a family, and a future. She had waited tables where she could not eat, and the man she loved had rewritten the law by spring. And in doing so, he had given her more than just a seat at the table. He had given her a life, a love, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And that, Shira thought, was the greatest gift of all.